Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. For myself, let me just say this. I have really enjoyed this conference because it's so unlike the conferences I usually attend in Washington, New York, and Boston. Normally, conferences on the future of South Asia, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan would be filled with people like me, talking about politics and the military, but to have Whit here, and to have, Samina was sitting there, there's Samina, to have Samina here, to have Athanasios here, to talk about the human interest and politics where it really matters at the grassroots, does, I think, give us a different perspective. President Kennedy, 6 months before he died, gave, I think, his greatest speech. It was a commencement speech, June 10th, 1963 at the American University. He'd come through the Berlin crisis. He had gone through the harrowing Cuban Missile Crisis. And in this transformative speech, he said, if we continue to pursue the narrow national interest, we and the Soviets, we will destroy ourselves. We have to elevate international politics to the human interest. Muhammad Yunus, when he gave his 2006 brilliant Nobel speech, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Bangladeshi founder of the Grameen Bank that capitalizes projects for women, Muhammad Yunus said, the human interest is the basis of international politics. And I think what Jim and John succeeded in doing, in bringing Whit and Samina Athanasios here, with the rest of us who practice international politics and think about it, was to bring us to the human interest. And I've really taken that away from this conference. Secondly, let me just say how profoundly affected I've been by the speakers. I'm someone who was part of the reason why NATO went into Afghanistan. I argued for it. I was the American ambassador to NATO when we went in. And I've overseen aspects of our policy, although I'm not an expert, the way that many of the speakers are. But I found myself agreeing with Paul on a lot of what he said. And then I found myself agreeing with Ron and a lot of what he said. Because I think they both gave us elemental ground truth, and they both spoke from their heart and through their intelligence. But the reason why I was going back and forth, as someone who's thought about these issues for 8 or 9 years, is it's hard. This is very complex business. This is international politics at its most challenging. So I appreciated all the thought and preparation that all of our speakers gave to their subjects. So I thought this morning, what could I possibly say that might add to the discussion? Probably not much, but I have some thoughts. I have 5 thoughts for the United States of America as we move forward. And they're not particularly brilliant, but I did try to think about what we've heard and try to put it down in an organized way, maybe to summarize a bit of what we've heard. And here's the first thought. We have vital national interests in South Asia and in the greater Middle East. And the reason I say that is because we did have a discussion yesterday, should we be there, is it worth it? And these are critical issues when we talk about the lives of our soldiers and the lives of the people that are affected by a military campaign as brutal and as long-lasting, 8.5 years, as the campaign in Afghanistan. I think in the course of my own career, and I started in the Foreign Service as an intern in the summer of 1980 in West Africa, all the way through to my last job in 2008, I saw and I felt and I experienced a profound shift in America's engagement with the world. All of us for 234 years had been focused, much of our history, on Europe, because that's where the fundamental challenges were for our society, from the 18th century through to the Kosovo War in 1999. And there has been a shift. The greatest challenges for us as a country are more in the Middle East and South Asia than they are in Europe. Europe is happily peaceful, united, whole, democratic, all those wonderful things. But there are great challenges to us through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and given the challenges posed by Iran's nuclear weapons program, and in what we do to try to exit honorably from Iraq. And those challenges do extend to Iran's influence in South Asia. And they definitely extend to the perils present in the Pakistani debate about what kind of country they will be and whether they can survive as a nation state. And they certainly extend to the fact that the United States is, whether we like it or not now, the central actor in Afghanistan through our military and through our economic aid programs. And so I can't get away from the fact that our strategic focus has shifted. That is not going to change for the rest of our lifetimes. Looking 50 or 100 years into the future, our children's and grandchildren's lifetimes. This is not a distant hinterland. It is actually the core of the 21st century challenges for our country from a strategic perspective. Because it's in this region, the greater Middle East, and of course looking east to Asia, it's where China is, the fastest growing country in the world. Our most fundamental and most important relationship in the world is with China, economically, militarily, politically. It's also where India lies. And I thought Tazy spoke very eloquently yesterday, Ambassador Schaefer, about the fundamental interest we have in forming a strategic partnership with India. It makes so much sense. We're the two largest and most successful democracies. 714 million Indians registered to vote in the May 2009 elections. This is an extraordinary country that is seeking a strategic relationship with the United States, and that country is in South Asia, the region that we've been looking at this weekend. And as I said before, Iran, in a more negative, forbidding way, is also part of this region. So when I say we have a vital interest, what I'm really saying is I don't think we have the choice of whether or not we want to be engaged or should be engaged. We are engaged, and we're the central actor, still the most powerful country in the world, and will be the most powerful country in the world, I'm quite sure, for a long time to come. That would be my first point. My second point has to do about Afghanistan and the fate of Afghanistan. It's not a cursory concern for Americans and for our national security. We've been there for 8.5 years. And to say that we should, no one here said we should walk away, not a single speaker, but we can't walk away. We can't walk away from Afghanistan because of its link to Pakistan and because of the India-Pakistan relationship and the interwoven relationships we have with all three of those countries. In Afghanistan, I think that President Obama has put forward a very sensible, very thoughtful policy. Despite our best efforts, and Ron and I served together, Ambassador Newman and I, in the second Bush term, and worked closely together. And no one worked harder to put together a sensible, intelligent policy towards Afghanistan than Ron Newman. I don't think we gave Ron all the tools he needed. Some of the tools that President Obama is now giving his military commanders and his diplomats and his aid workers. We had a very strong military effort in Afghanistan. Beginning in the autumn of 2001, within 3.5 weeks of 9/11, we went into Afghanistan and had some initial successes. And I was there in 2002 and 3 and 4, like a lot of other people. We didn't see the threat from the Taliban, and there wasn't the threat from the Taliban that materialized by 2005, 6, 7, and 8. So we had a conventional military effort. I do agree with President Obama, we did take our eye off this challenge. And in my estimation, became involved in a very unfortunate way in a war in Iraq, which drew us in another direction when we should have had our singular attention on the problems of South Asia from the very beginning. What President Obama has done is to say militarily, a conventional military strategy cannot work. A counterinsurgency strategy of the type that Larry described and that Paul talked about and Ron talked about might be able to work in the future. In other words, a policy that would put the security of the Afghan people where they live as the primary focus of the policy, that would rely less on firepower, less on indiscriminate bombing, although we've seen evidence even in the last 10 days of an U.S. artillery strike that killed more than 10 Afghan civilians. And a policy that would rely more on just securing people where they are and protecting them from the Taliban and the other insurgents. But here's the really important thing. And then hook that up with economic aid and rehabilitation and housing construction and schools so that if the Marines are able to, in the conventional sense of the word, take and occupy Marja, which has been the focus of our efforts over the last 10 days, then the people of Marja will be able to see that the Afghan government and the international community would would support them and provide some concrete assistance after the Taliban is driven out. And that has not been happening in large measure over the last 7 or 8 years. We've taken lots of towns, but the lives of the people in those towns have not necessarily improved after the fact. That's how I understand, in a very basic, perhaps too elementary way, what the president is talking about in General McChrystal in counterinsurgency. And I think those who talked about effective economic aid, particularly agriculture, 70 or 80% of the people in Afghanistan are occupied with agriculture. If we can make a difference through our economic assistance programs, all of us around the world, in helping the Afghan people not to produce 1/3 of their GDP through poppy production and the sale of poppy and heroin, then that might make another difference. So I'm willing, as a citizen, to support President Obama and to give this counterinsurgency strategy a try, because we haven't tried it effectively over the first 8.5 years. Third point would be this. I do very much agree with Paul and others, and I think a lot of people said this, that there is no military victory of the sort that we would understand possible in this country. And the commitment to try to win a conventional military victory would be so excessive in the number of American troops involved that it wouldn't be worth the effort. And so I don't think we should, if we fail at 108,000 troops to achieve some victories over the Taliban, I wouldn't be in favor of going to 200,000 troops or 300,000 troops. 40, 50 years ago, we tried that in Vietnam, and it didn't work out very well there. But if we can counter the Taliban and slow their offensives down, if we can begin to secure more of the population where we are, then perhaps we can get to what a lot of the speakers were talking about yesterday. A policy that is probably in the coming years less focused on the military and more focused on diplomacy and on aid and on civilian efforts and on education and on reconciliation between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban. Now, none of us know if this will work. None of us know if the Taliban will agree to reconcile. Certainly the senior members may not, people like Mullah Omar. But it seems to me that if we rely just on a military approach, we're not going to succeed. And so we have to quickly transition to an approach that would put much more weight and much more emphasis on the diplomatic aid and negotiation side. This is a difficult thing to do. We tend to demonize the people that we face, sometimes across the negotiating table, but certainly across the battlefield. And yet, if you look at the history of these types of wars around the world, civil wars, they almost always end in reconciliation. They almost always end through political talks, through the government and the insurgents compromising at some point on their basic objectives. I can't see the Afghan war ending any differently than that. And so transitioning to a political diplomatic phase, it seems to me, is something that the Obama administration needs to do, hopefully after some initial successes of the military campaign that General McChrystal and General Petraeus have engineered. The two people who did, in my judgment, a very fine job in rescuing a failed Iraq policy, turning it around in 2008 and 2009 so that we now can leave that country. A fourth point. And I was really impressed by Samina's presentation, very impressed by it. And what I took from her presentation was, don't give up on Pakistan. Our media is so, I think, fundamentally negative about that country. And sometimes those of us in government and out are also negative. We have a difficult relationship with the Pakistani government. It is complicated. It is often bitter. It is a mistrustful relationship with the government. But Pakistan matters. It matters geographically when you look at the map, as we've seen lots of maps this weekend. It matters because of the size of the country. It matters because of its very difficult but symbiotic relationship with India. And I can't see giving up on that relationship either, because the alternative is, if the worst case ever happened, and I don't think it will, but if it did, can you imagine the strategic consequences for us and for the Pakistani people should a radical Islamist group or set of groups topple the government in Islamabad? It would be an absolute catastrophe for our strategic interests, given the fact that Pakistan is a nuclear weapons country. So here, again, a policy that would rely not just on military assistance to the Pakistani army, but that is important. Because we've seen this weekend how fundamentally important the safe havens in Pakistan are in determining the course of the war in Afghanistan. Continue the military assistance, but do much more in the way of economic assistance for the people of Pakistan. And Senator Kerry and Senator Lugar, the chairman and ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, sponsored and passed a bill this year that would for the first time extend significant American economic assistance to the people of Pakistan. Can we make that assistance felt? Can it be properly applied? And can we do what Samina and Cynthia and others have been talking about, Ambassador Schneider, and think about not just building military and economic bridges, but cultural bridges to countries like Pakistan? If we're to improve our relationship, it's not going to happen overnight, but perhaps over years and decades through the kind of programs that both Samina and Cynthia were talking about. We build some people-to-people bridges that will be more enduring, I think, even than the military and economic aid that we pay for. And so I would invest very heavily in Pakistan from a political point of view and a people-to-people point of view. And I was really taken by some of the suggestions that both of them made yesterday. Finally, on Pakistan, it may be paranoia, it may be wrong, but the Pakistani government, military and civilian, is convinced that India is a strategic threat to them. And the United States cannot disregard that. I'm someone who spent much more of my career working with India. But I think that those of us who are close to the Indians and value that relationship, what we have to understand is we need to help Pakistan with India. We can be a mediator of sorts. Maybe not an overt, visible mediator on Kashmir. But we have influence with both governments. We should use it. We should help both governments in the uneasy way that they work together to meet, to talk, to try to diminish their problems. There's a dialogue of sorts between the foreign secretaries of India and Pakistan. It has been broken many, many times in the past communication. It's going to resume in the next 10 days. The United States is not going to be in the room and shouldn't be at the room. But we can be behind the scenes helping the Pakistanis and Indian governments to find some common ground, to resolve differences. They've nearly gone to war with each other, two nuclear-armed countries, twice since 1999. That would be catastrophic for them, for the people of the region, and for us. And so I think that the United States needs to be engaged in the Kashmir problem, behind the scenes. And I know we need to be engaged in the complex of Pakistani-Indian differences that are so important. And we need to be the balancer, if we can, in that relationship. Fifth, and finally, we need to build this global partnership with India. And it's not a zero-sum game. We don't have to choose between India and Pakistan. I think I said the other day, one of the great insights that Condoleezza Rice had when she came to become Secretary of State in January 2005. She made her first trip to Delhi and Islamabad in March of that year. She came back from that trip and she told a number of us, you know, the problem we've got in South Asia is that we feel that we're locked into this zero-sum competition between India and Pakistan. We can't make a move towards India without having to make the same move towards Pakistan. If we have this meeting with the Indians, we've got to have an equal meeting with the Pakistanis. They're different countries. We have different relationships with them. We need to dehyphenate that relationship. We don't have a relationship with India-Pakistan. We have a relationship with 1.1 billion Indians. And we have a relationship with several hundred million Pakistanis, and they're very different, and they'll look differently. And so she separated the two, and President Obama has maintained that separation. And so I think that what we need to do with India is build this strategic partnership that's so much in our fundamental national interest. As someone who, you know, tries to think about America's standing in the world, I'm convinced of one thing. The single most important question we will face in the next century is China. We shouldn't try to defeat China. We can't. We can't contain China. We've got to work with China. They're our largest creditor, and we're their largest export market. And they're the second strongest country in the world and will soon become, I think, in a decade or two, the second strongest military power in the world. How do we work with China to make sure that China's rise is peaceful and doesn't disrupt the balance of power in Asia and doesn't diminish the standing of the United States Well, we work with India and Japan and Australia, but particularly India. We're not going to be an ally with India the way we're allied with Japan or Germany or Britain. India is too big, too proud, too independent. But the Indians see this strategic question as well. And they see it the way we do. And so building up a political partnership with India, taking advantage of this enormously expansive trade and investment relationship. If you're in business and you're in the high-tech sector, you've probably been to India. There's a virtual bridge between Bangalore and Hyderabad in southern India to Route 128 and a Research Triangle and a Silicon Valley. I saw a Duke University study a couple of years ago. 1 out of every 7 startups in Silicon Valley is by an Indian or an Indian American. We are building a high-tech partnership with India. We have 3 million Indian Americans now, and that community is growing, that are making a fundamental impact in business and in politics in our country. But strategically, in South Asia, the region that we've been studying this weekend, India is the keystone country. It's a successful country. It's the second largest Muslim country in the world, and yet the Indians have found a way to weave together a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious society. They've struggled with it, as we have, over 234 years, but they're moving forward in a positive direction, and they want to have this relationship with us. India is critical for this big question of China. It's critical for American engagement in the most important part of the world, the greater Middle East. And India will go a long way in helping to write the history of South Asia positively or negatively. So Indian involvement in Afghanistan helps us, but not if it's too much in the security realm, because that'll antagonize Pakistan. But India can build infrastructure, and India can build schools, and India can give political support to the Afghan government. And if we are able to help the Indians and Pakistanis manage the relationship just so that it kind of lurches forward and doesn't end in a catastrophic way, that will be progress of sorts. Last point on India. Power's changing in the world. We're going to have less of it as Americans in the future, less than we did in the 20th century. We have to get used to that. We'll still be the most powerful country, but among equals. We need to open up avenues for leadership by the Indians. President Obama has transitioned from the G8 to the G20. He recognizes India, China, Brazil, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Turkey need to be in the room. When we discuss the financial crisis, the same is true of politics. The fact that we have a Security Council, the most powerful political organization in the world of sorts, that is the balance of power of September 1945, right? That's what it is. The veto-wielding countries were the victors in the Second World War. That doesn't include India, and doesn't include Japan, and doesn't include Brazil, and not a single African country on it is not representative of where we are in the 21st century. And India personifies that for me. Open up leadership positions for India so that we can work with them globally. Final point. I gave you 5 thoughts. But there was this challenge. And it was actually at the cocktail party at the waterfront restaurant on Friday night. Are we going to feel better by Sunday? That's the conversation that we had. So I thought I should answer that. And here's how I'd answer it. I can see all the dangers that we've studied this weekend. I could probably put together the scenario for failure in Afghanistan by the United States by 2012 or 13. I can certainly see how we will fail in Pakistan. But that's not how I think this story is going to end. And I'm not the smartest person here. I'm certainly not the expert that a lot of our speakers are. But as I think about this, I think in Afghanistan the Taliban cannot overthrow the government, and the Taliban cannot defeat us. If we can contain that threat and push them back a little through this counterinsurgency strategy, and then transition towards a political decision, and then we get out at some point, I could see that happening too. In Pakistan, I think the army and the people, as Samina describes them, are too strong for the Islamists. The Islamists are making lots of noise and some inroads, but that's a considerably strong society. And the army is strong. I don't see the worst happening. If I had to bet my own money, I don't see the worst happening in Pakistan. And I would think in the future, we're going to see this region kind of move forward in a very fitful, difficult way, but begin to move forward. And I guess I take heart in our president. And I'm someone who worked at a very low level as an intern in the Carter administration, then for Reagan as a very junior diplomat, and then for George H.W. Bush and President Clinton and President George W. Bush. So a lot of us who worked in government have seen a lot of American presidents. We've worked with them. We've had the pleasure and honor of briefing them, attending meetings with them. I think we've got the smartest, most patient, most skillful, and maybe the most far-sighted president in President Obama that we've had in a long time. And you know, I got very frustrated when he openly questioned our policy in Afghanistan in September. I thought, this is not a good message to the military. It's not a good message to the young soldiers that the commander-in-chief is publicly wavering, wondering. But then at the end of it, when he gave the West Point speech, I thought, how refreshing that before he commits another 30,000 young people to battle and to combat in places like Marja, he's going to make sure that he sits in a room for weeks and months on end to work through every element of strategy and tactics. And he's a young president, and he's got the most difficult agenda imaginable, economic and foreign policy. I think the most difficult of any president since FDR. But I think he's making the right decisions about South Asia. And he's putting the building blocks in place. And it may not work, but it's the best we have. And I'm impressed by him. And so, do we feel better? On Sunday at noon, I feel that that our president is leading us in the right direction in this part of the world. Final thought. It's not just up to him, it's up to us. Whether it's $1 trillion in Afghanistan, I hope it's not. The debate we had yesterday, over the next 10 years. If we think that the answer to troubles overseas is isolation, and we've often thought that in our history, and we've pulled back. You can see it from the 18th to the 21st century. Or if we think it's unilateralism, we're so big and wonderful and strong we can go it alone. We tried that in 2002 and 2003, and we failed. We have to lead, and we have to be engaged, and we have to provide the leadership, sometimes for other peoples and other countries, because that's how the international system works. I think we've got a great president. He needs the citizens of this country to back him up. And I do believe in the goodness of this country, and I believe in the effectiveness of our government, of our soldiers and diplomats to do the right thing and to be effective. I feel better Sunday at 10:30. Thank you. Okay, so before we break, happy to take questions. If any of you have questions. John.
I must say, Mr. Ambassador, your participation in this conference has been nothing short of sensational.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
I do have a question.
I thought you would.
Question. There's been hardly any mention of the oil in Central Asia. Does the United States have a strategic interest in that resource?
Yes. Yeah, we didn't, we saw on Larry's maps, and Larry, I thought, gave a really vivid description of how geography informs politics, that Central Asia, what we would call Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, that those countries play a big role in the politics of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, because those Central Asian countries have the oil and gas that the South Asian countries need. And I think a lot of speakers talked about the influence of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan politically and militarily on the Northern Alliance and in the northern part of Afghanistan. So we can't carve these regions into clean blocks. they are integrated with each other, more or less. And the energy picture in one of the long-term ambitions we had in both the Clinton and Bush administrations was to reorient Pakistani and Indian views northward, that instead of relying on what we felt were undependable countries like Iran for oil and gas, we wanted to sanction Iran for very good reasons, we were encouraging the Indians and Pakistanis to think about gas from Turkmenistan and oil from Kazakhstan, and to spend the money with the World Bank and through venture capital to build the pipelines that would create north-south energy links between Central and South Asia. So it's a very important element. We just didn't get to it as much. But I thought that some of the maps would indicate that that's a big part of the geopolitics of this new 21st century great game being played. And we didn't really get to the fact that Russia has considerable interests in South and Central Asia. The 5 countries of Central Asia were republics of the Soviet Union. And that China, all of the Larry's string of pearls, it was Larry's map, I think, the string of pearls map, showed the outright naval and military competition between China and India for naval and maritime control, in other words, of the Indian Ocean. And just one little footnote on this. There's a guy named Robert Kaplan who lives in Lenox, Massachusetts. A lot of you know him through Balkan Goes. He's been writing for The Atlantic for 20 or 30 years. He has got a new book coming out called Monsoon. It's coming out in September. And this is Bob's thesis. His thesis is that the Indian Ocean will become, for the 21st century, the central arena of competition and opportunity, as Europe was for the 20th century. Because so much of the world's oil and gas flows through the Straits of Malacca in the east to the Gulf of Aden in the west. So much of the world's container traffic. And because, as he says, and I invited him down to speak to my class at Harvard, he made a very compelling presentation. He said he thought the 4 greatest naval and air powers of the 21st century will be Japan, India, China, and the United States. And they all happen to see the Indian Ocean as central to their security. And so he thought that the great strategic competition or cooperation will be in that region among those 4 countries. Larry showed that slide yesterday that outright shows what India and China are trying to do. Can the United States work with all of them to keep this peaceful and to keep the traffic and commerce of the world flowing, and not to have the Pakistanis and Sri Lankans as victims of this, but can we create a strategic space that is peaceful and harmonious, more or less, in the next 50 to 100 years? That's a pretty compelling thesis. It's Robert Kaplan's thesis. And we might even think about inviting him to a future Camden Conference to talk about it. I think, has he been here? He's already been here. I think we should invite him back, but that's just my view. Yes?
I'm Jake with Defense Department. I have a question for you on NATO, and will NATO survive Afghanistan? Will the idea of collective security be completely, revamped? Will NATO be able to survive with only some participants actually participating militarily, others taking a step aside?
Well, that's a question close to my heart, and I think of a lot of the people who served with the alliance, and there are a lot of us here over the last 20 or 30 years. NATO must survive. NATO's not just that anti-Soviet alliance that helped to win the Cold War. If you look at what NATO's done since the end of the Cold War, NATO intervened to end the Bosnian War through military power and diplomacy in the autumn of '95. NATO intervened in Kosovo in May, June of '99 to save 1 million Kosovar Muslim Albanians who were under attack from Slobodan Milosevic. Stop that. NATO still is, I think, the best collection of military cohesion for peacekeeping. We're still keeping the peace in Bosnia and Kosovo. And NATO now has a strategic view that the members, Canada, the United States, and 26 European countries, ought to be working with the Arab countries and Israel and Japan, Australia, and South Korea, our 3 allies in the East. It's not going to become a global alliance by membership, but it will by function. There's no other military organization in the world of which I'm aware that has as much military reach and capacity to do good things, disaster release and peacekeeping. So NATO must survive. But your question's a great one, because this is the first ground operation in NATO's 61-year history. NATO will be 61 years of age on April 4th of this year. We never fought that Third World War in Europe, thank goodness, against the Soviets. We used air power against the Serbs in Bosnia and Kosovo. First time we've been on the ground, and we're not succeeding. NATO has not acquitted itself well. And I don't think that's the fault of our country. I said yesterday, one of the problems is that there's 26 of us. We all voted to go in to a combat mission, but only 10 or 12 of us have fought in combat in the East and South, which is where almost all the fighting is. And some of the largest countries, Germany, Italy, and Spain, have said, we will not go into combat, but we'll keep the peace for you in the North and West. Not good enough. NATO was formed against Stalin to be all for one and one for all, and NATO has not been that since August of 2003 when we went in. And so the challenge is for those large European countries to make the same commitment that Denmark and the Eastern allies, Bulgaria, Romania, the Czechs have met, and they're not meeting it now. So it's a great challenge. Difficult, because the war is so unpopular in Western Europe. Difficult for these governments, but they signed up to it, and they've left us shouldering most of the burden, which is not fair in my judgment. Thank you for that question. I hope and believe NATO shall survive. Yes?
I'm Richard Chate from Camden. Your first point in your summary was about the U.S. that you view as powerful, and yes, we are still powerful, but I think we're not as powerful as many of us think we are. And your last part was about the citizens need to participate. It seems to me that you're fundamentally asking us to spend a lot of money in South Asia, a lot of resources, blood, treasure. I think we also need, I think everybody in this room realizes we need to spend money on healthcare. We need to balance our budget. We need to invest in education here. We need to invest in American industry to be competitive. I don't see how you get the numbers to work unless you get the people in this room to cut their consumption by 20%.
Thank you.
I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, it's a good challenge, and I don't necessarily disagree with anything. I want a balanced budget. I'm a citizen too, pay taxes. I want health care. I want a health care bill that would provide health care for the 40 million Americans that don't have it. But I also believe that we don't live in the 19th century. We live in the 21st, a highly integrated global environment. And while, in the 18th century, Jefferson essentially said, we should build that empire of liberty here at home. We should not go, John Quincy Adams said, we should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We should stay home. Hamilton said, no, we should compete with the empires. This debate has been going on for 234 years. But what's different is we weren't as highly dependent on other countries for our well-being, for our investment capital, for our trade then in the 18th century as we certainly are now. And I don't see how you say we have to resolve all the problems at home first, and then when we've done that, we'll turn, I'm not saying you're saying this, that we turn to foreign affairs. We have to do both. Now, something's got to give. Sometimes you might say, well, we just can't afford that foreign mission. Other times we might have to say we have to raise taxes. Politicians don't like to say that. I don't see how we don't raise taxes on us to pay for the deficit or pay it down and to pay for our international engagement. I say that as a taxpayer. And I wish our politicians would be more straight with us about the predicament that we're in. But I don't see the division between domestic and foreign policy anymore, the way that in the 18th or 19th century you might see it. Because if we don't engage with China and India, then we're going to really hurt our basic economic interests for the future. And so I see a coming together of both. And we elect smart people like Barack Obama to make these choices. And there may be times when we spend more time on domestic imperatives and other times more on foreign, but I don't see the division. I see the integration between them. I don't want to spend $1 trillion on the military in Afghanistan the next 10 years. I don't think there's a military victory. I would hope within a year or two we'd begin to transition to a diplomatic strategy. I don't think we should go over 100,000 troops. And so that may be part of the answer, that we do have to have our eye on on those the domestic impact on foreign policy as we make those decisions. Hope that answers your question. Yes.
Hi, Angeli from College of the Atlantic again. With the most respect, I was wondering what your opinion is of the opinion that the U.S. has used its status as a global monolith to draw other countries and organizations into their conflict as a sort of ultimatum, like, are you with terror or against it?
That's a really good question. Looking back on it, you know, I understood why President Bush reacted the way he did after 9/11. That was a searing psychological moment for us. I think he said those words in the week after 9/11, or in days after 9/11. Looking back on it with the benefit of hindsight, and hindsight's always 20/20, that was an unfortunate choice of words, because it described a challenge that shouldn't have been made that way. And you know, Americans don't want to give the rest of the world the impression, if you don't agree with us on everything, we're not going to work with you, or we're going to take it out on you. So I would agree with that sentiment. We have to be a little bit more sophisticated in our choice of words, how we talk. But here's how I worked for the US government for 27 years, 3 months, and 9 days. They sent me a letter. Libby and I got a letter when I retired. You worked for 27, I was amazed, 3 months and I felt like writing back in how many minutes? So, but I did, and I look back on my career and I know that I made mistakes and strategic miscalculations, and I know that our government did. I've mentioned one. I think it was not in our interest to go into Iraq in 2003 the way we did. But I also know this. I'm very proud of our government, not just our country, but its government. I think we've made some mistakes, but we've gotten a lot more right. We are fundamental to this world. The world is better off with American military and political and commercial engagement. We're critical to all these regions. The reason why speaker after speaker has said we can't walk away is because we do make a difference. And I still believe that, you know, our basic ideals that come from the founders of this country are ideals that other people believe in, and we represent that. When the president met the Dalai Lama the other day, he was standing up to the Chinese, and he was saying, we may have to trade with you, we may need you in a lot of ways, but we don't have to submit to authoritarianism, and we can still uphold religious freedom through the Dalai Lama. And so we have a special role. And I think more often than not, we play that role very well in the world. And I agree with Athanasios. You see our military, and you see how dedicated they are and how well they do. You see our diplomats and the sacrifices they make. I hope people don't have the impression that we have a fumbling government, an ineffective government. We have a great government in the way that we apply ourselves overseas. So I'm proud of what our government has done. And I don't think that somehow we're this uncaring hegemon or a monolith, as you said. It draws other countries into conflict. I see it the reverse more often than not, despite the mistakes that we make from time to time. Yes?
Sir, thank you for your comments. Courtney Haight, what would you think of a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan that didn't have a U.S. label on it, that was funded by the stakeholders, Iran, Russia, China, India, Pakistan? Is that a doable thing? You know, are we? But you know, something's got to happen in Pakistan to make the fact that we can't get out viable, seems to me.
Well, I like the idea that it's not all up to us, to Americans, that we shouldn't foot the bill for every major international venture. And here's a big challenge for India, China, for instance. They pay very little in dues to the UN, proportionally compared to us and the Japanese. They don't engage the Chinese, certainly, in the type of programs we do. You know, President Bush and Obama have committed a $30 billion HIV/AIDS program for Southern Africa and the Caribbean. So as they take their positions in world leadership, they need to assume the responsibilities of world leadership. And I like the direction of your question, that if they have a vested interest in the future of Afghanistan, they ought to increase their economic aid. And it shouldn't just be up to the American people and the American taxpayer to do that. And that's how that's leadership in the 21st century, it seems to me. And it's what we should be urging China, especially China, to undertake. It's a rather mercantilistic foreign policy being run by Beijing. And it doesn't have the kind of outward extension of aid that Japan, Western Europe, and the United States have been engaged in for 60 years. So I like that. People, when Ron comes up here and others for the panel after the break, ask that question, because Ron would have a very good sense, Paul might as well. Could we actually convince some of these regional powers to commit substantial economic resources? I hope we can. We should make the effort. My time's up. I've enjoyed it. We'll take a half-hour break, and we'll come back here at 11 o'clock. Thank you.